we're going to go to our second panel. The second panel is a group of individuals with disabilities. We thought if this is Financial Capability Month, let's talk directly to people in the disability community. Let me introduce you to our second panel. All the way to the far end is Andy Arias, Policy Advisor, Office of Disability Employment Policy, U.S. Department of Labor. Oscar Jimenez Solomon, Research Scientist, New York State Psychiatric Institute with Columbia University. Maria Town, Director of the Houston Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. I skipped. Joseph Santini, Program Manager, Communications Services for the Deaf, CSD Learns. And on the end, Anil Lewis, Executive Director, Jernigan Institute, National Federation of the Blind. Thank you all for joining us today. And we're going to do this without presentations. We're going to do it just in terms of questions. And I will pull up questions on the screen and pull from the list that we have. The first question, I'm going to direct it to Oscar, is we know from data that was reported by FLEC, everyone knows what that is now, Financial Literacy and Education Commission, that households with disabilities have 5 times less wealth than married couples with no member with a disability in the family. About $31,000 versus $163,000 net assets. In addition to the extra costs of living with a disability, does lack of knowledge and skill to make informed financial decisions pose a critical challenge? And what are some of the other issues to financial instability?
Well, first, I'd like to say, I'd like to thank Michael, NDI, and also MSRB for having us here, and also for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's a very important topic, especially on this month of financial capability. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity for disability advocates and other individuals who are very involved with the community to have a voice at the table as well. So, you know, I'm here both as a researcher and as an advocate. And as an advocate, I would like to say that I was very pleased to hear Patrick, I think in his initial remarks, talk about the potential that people with disabilities have to have a better financial future. And I think, unfortunately, we're still in that battle where in some of our communities, sometimes disability providers, sometimes families, sometimes ourselves, we still think that our potential is much smaller than it really is. And as an advocate, I want to say we can work, we can learn to manage our finances, we can be part of making our own financial decisions, we can save, and all those are things that become more a matter of the question. I think as advocates and as a researcher, for me also is more what needs to be done, or what does it take, or what it would take for that financial future to be better. And as part of what you're bringing up on question number one, this first question, Michael. First, it always astounds me to see the disparities that exist not only around income and wealth among people with disabilities and without disabilities. It's a very sad picture, and I think it's not only it's an issue of social justice, and it's also an issue of disparities that I think we have the moral responsibility to address as a society. And so now, what I would say to that, I would add, is part of the research that we've been doing. I would also add that those disparities may even be greater, and I think you alluded to that in your presentation, when we consider ethnic, racial disparities, originally, socioeconomic differences that people already had to begin with, and a number of other sources of disparities. And we've been doing this study with individuals with psychiatric disabilities in the public mental health system in New York State. And what I'm here to say actually is that about 3/4 of the people in the study that we're interviewing, that we've surveyed, about 200 people in the public mental health system, have incomes below the federal poverty line. So this is 75%. And actually about 1/4 of them are living with incomes of less than 50% of the federal poverty line for a household of one. That is actually what's called deep poverty, which is not just simply poverty or low income. We're talking about people who have levels of poverty that are hard to understand, perhaps for some of us. So what I might actually say to that is that, also since we're in a panel around financial literacy and financial capability, what I just wanted to also offer is this challenge that we have as a community of people who are trying to do this work to think through a little bit more what we mean when we say financial capability and what we mean when we say financial literacy, because in their lies, I think, the understanding of what the variables and the causes are. I'll just go to the point. From the research we've been doing, we conclude that financial knowledge and financial literacy is important, is essential, but it's not sufficient. That the reasons why people make some of the decisions that they make is because of two other big factors: the financial stressors that people are in, which are, for example, the poverty that people live in, that push them to actually make decisions that wouldn't make sense otherwise, and because of the poor access to financial services that people are disconnected from, right? So if I know, and I'll just mention one thing from the research, and with this I'll end, is that we've been doing is that we have found that people with the same level of knowledge and attitudes, right? Let me back this up. People that have higher level of knowledge and more positive attitudes towards money, spending, and savings, right, still have the same financial behaviors as people with lower knowledge and more negative attitudes, right? Meaning things like paying bills on time, planning financial future, and a few other things that we would think are actually part of that financial capability, which to me, and some in the field, what that tells me is that there, other than the knowledge and the attitudes, there are other things that get in people's way. That when you hold constant knowledge and attitudes, right, still financial behaviors are not necessarily much better. And I think part of the missing link here is some of the things that have been already presented here, like having access concretely to earned income tax credit, banking services, and a few others. And just to end that point, what I would say is that if I had to choose one area of financial knowledge or knowledge that is really important, is knowledge about the financial services and supports.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to go to Andy on the end, and this is the second question that's up there, and it's about the fact we've studied and found that people in the disability community are using alternative financial services, payday lenders, pawn shops to access credit. And maybe to the degree you're willing to talk about it, from your personal experience, why do people turn to those alternative financial services, and how do we improve the trust and the relationships to mainstream financial services?
So I want to touch on 2 points because I like what you were saying, Oscar, but one of the things I want to address in the first question is the cost of living for individuals with disabilities is something that is not discussed when you discuss financial well-being. And one of the things that constantly comes up for individuals with disabilities was the need for a PA or personal attendant services. So that could come at a cost of, like, for myself, it's $400 a month. That's extra added expense that if you don't have a disability, you don't think about, right? That's $400 a month coming out of somewhere that health services do not pay for, and some employers don't have the ability to pay for either. So when you're looking at financial wellness and financial stability of individuals with disabilities, that's just one more point I wanted to bring up to address some of your concerns, Oscar, as well. And to Michael's point for the second question, I think marketing to people with disabilities, specifically in media, is one of the ways that financial institutions can move the needle forward and having individuals with disabilities access their services better. My personal story is I was raised in systemic poverty, and the idea of savings to me was not even discussed. It was very much living paycheck to paycheck. And, you know, when you got the paycheck, you were able to do things. When you didn't have a paycheck, you didn't do anything. And I remember very specifically, my grandmother said, my grandma was Hispanic, and her idea of savings was putting money in a mattress. And she said, this is much better than banks. Don't trust banks. And I was like, okay, fine. So that to me as a young child was how I looked at money. It was more of a fearful kind of like, well, if I have it, it's good. If I don't have it, it's bad. And it wasn't until I got a job at 17 that I really said, okay, I need to open up a bank account. I need to have a checking and savings account. But I still was fearful financially. So I feel like financial institutions really need to market and really need to address the concerns of the disability community and meet them where they are in order for them to have access to their services.
Thank you, Andy. I'll turn to Joseph. We've done a lot of work with the deaf community, and there have been, in our experiences, lots of, again, personal challenges. Maybe you'd like to comment on either Oscar or Andy's comments so far. What can be done, particularly the deaf community is certainly its own culture, its own group. How could more be done with the deaf community to improve their knowledge and improve their relationships with the mainstream financial banking community?
Thank you, Michael. So I just want to open up by saying thank you to the National Disability Institute for welcoming us to come and present today. And to follow up on Oscar's comments, we believe that the deaf community is in a very unique situation. There's 80 million people in the United States that identify as having some type of hearing loss. And about 4 million of them actually do communicate using ASL. And so the result is that we are desperate and hungry for resources in education. And there are some specific challenges that come up with regards to communication and communication access, which is usually limited for deaf people who are born with hearing parents who haven't learned sign language as of yet. So that means from a beginning age, there is a lack of environmental accessibility to information that people are sharing around them. The second thing that's unique is that when we arrive to the school system and thinking they don't have that the deaf individuals don't have access to the type of education and specifically financial education in both in ASL and in English. And just 3 years ago, the curriculum was finally established for deaf and hard of hearing individuals, focusing on financial literacy. That was back in 2015, and that curriculum hasn't been spread out or dispersed far enough throughout the United States. The third issue is when deaf individuals are graduating from school, they are severely underemployed. 70% of deaf and hard of hearing individuals are either unemployed or underemployed here in the United States. And 48.1% of deaf community members don't have access to the workforce. And that has a huge impact on the middle class. That's only 14% of our community who are earning that middle class status. And not only do we not gain the information from our family members or from our school systems, but it also impacts us at a working age with those lack of experiences that we need to build those fundamental knowledges that we require to make competent decisions. What we need to do is partner better with financial institutions to create and develop more and more ASL resources. And we really do respect the IRS for their various tax information that they put out on their website, but it's one of the few organizations that actually are making that type of effort to make ASL resources for the deaf community. And so with those types of resources, we're seeing the increase of the deaf community's understanding of the tax structure and the tax system. But there also are profound issues with debt in the deaf community. So we would like to see more financial institutions doing more partnering with the deaf organizations in their local communities. Those local organizations can help them figure out how to meet the community's needs and to provide better accessibility for the financial information to the community. And so we do want to recognize the NDI for their work in Boston, where they've partnered with Deaf Inc. to provide financial resources for people in Boston in that regional area. So we would love to see more of that in a widespread way throughout the United States. And my organization now, CSD, we're partnering with Wells Fargo for developing financial information series with more hands-on information about billing. So we're looking forward to seeing that have an effect on the community moving forward this fall.
Thank you, Joseph. I will tell you, too, that we've added to the ABLE National Resource Center recently in sign language, basic introduction to ABLE accounts, so that, again, more people who are deaf could access that information in sign language and begin to think about ABLE accounts. Let me turn to Maria and maybe two sides of this. Andy, and I think for everyone, person with disabilities, without disabilities, our family experience growing up really is where you start to learn. And you learn good habits, you learn bad habits. You experience things that certainly set your path. But you also, you're now the commissioner of the Mayor's Office for Disabilities in Houston. You faced probably as formidable a challenge new in your job with the flooding and that created all kinds of instability, but certainly impacted people with disabilities. So maybe start with at your own level and experiences. Does that impact what you know and how you've learned about making informed financial decisions? And then from an experience at a municipal level, are there lessons learned you can share with us that might help people in other cities?
Certainly, Michael, and I want to echo my fellow panelists' comments and just say thank you so much for having me here. So on a personal level, like Andy, I grew up in poverty. I identify as having a developmental disability, and from a toddler to age 22, I received SSI. The expectation for me, from my family and from the environment around me, was that I would get an education, I would get a job, and I would get off SSI. And that is thankfully what happened, okay? So I not only identify as a self-advocate, I also identify as a sibling advocate. I have two younger brothers, both of whom have disabilities. And for myself, while my disability is very apparent, my mind worked very well in a traditional school setting. My brothers have non-apparent disabilities, and school was not a place where they thrived. All right. So my middle brother in particular is someone who never quite got that magic diagnosis that got him access to services, that sent up the red flag saying, here's someone who is eligible for benefits or for supports. And finally, as an adult, he gets a diagnosis, and after really struggling to maintain his well-being and her own, my mom has to fight to get him on benefits. And as someone who has worked in disability employment for almost a decade, I am someone who's saying, yes, at this instance, benefits can be a lifesaver. And although I believe that my brother can work, I want him to have, and my family to have, some of the financial security that Social Security benefits can provide so that he is able to maintain his well-being while still living his own life. That knowledge has been incredibly valuable for me in my role as the director of the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, because I'm able to talk to families honestly about how to make decisions around benefits. And right now, I'm in the middle of trying to convince my mother and my brother to set up an ABLE account. And let me tell you about some of the hesitancy. Because of the overwhelming information and kind of cultural idea that if you're on benefits, you can't work and you can't have any money, there's a huge resistance to setting up an ABLE account. because able accounts are still so new, it is difficult for someone like my mom to find an adult in her position who is a representative payee to talk to someone and say, how did setting up an able account work for you? And a big question is, what does this section mean when it says that the state can come back and take up any unused assets? Do we just lose all that? Right? So I am knee-deep in negotiating all of this right now from a very personal standpoint. And Texas is just getting its able account off the ground. And so I'm actually in a great position to have these conversations with both individuals with disabilities and their families. From a broader sort of municipal standpoint, I want to tell you all a story. And Michael, this gets to the point you were making about the new generation of people with disabilities and how prepared they are to enter into the career workforce. So I joke, but it really is sincere. Most people don't call my office when something good has happened, right? We don't get, hello, Director Town, I've had a great day, everything's going smoothly, I just wanted to let you know, right? We get, is this the mayor's office? I have to report something that's happened to me, I've been discriminated against, or a lot of times it's people who are so worried about their ability to maintain a roof over their heads, their ability to pay their bills, etc. So one day I answer the phone, and it is parents, two very savvy parents, who have a son who is in an inclusive higher education program. These are programs that originally started under TIPSID, programs that many people in this room fought for. And they call me and they say, Ms. Town, our son has received $11,000 in scholarships to attend school. Right? This is a huge moment of celebration. But instead, for them, it's a moment of fear, because they are afraid that those scholarships will endanger the very benefits that get their son personal attendance services. And everyone that they've talked to, all of the local resources that they've engaged have all said, no, he can't accept those scholarships. And by the time they got to me, thankfully, because of my own knowledge of Social Security policy, I can say, actually, he can, but here's how you have to be careful about managing those scholarship dollars. So this is a young man who has been able to get to the point where he's going to get a college degree, right? And yet, that's endangered because there's a lack of local awareness of alternative financial tools. And one of the other things that we come up against all the time is a lack of access to the internet. So all of the resources that were pointed out on the previous panel are all primarily based online. They're excellent resources, but so often with older adults who have disabilities, or with younger people with disabilities who are living in poverty, they do not have consistent access to the internet. And so I, as a local resource, can't just direct them to a website. I have to find someone in the local area who is aware of that resource, who is there in person, who can sit down and walk someone through these tools. And so I would really stress to federal and state agencies, empower local organizations with tools that are not based on the internet. All that does is add more barriers to individuals, particularly those in poverty, to navigate resources that they may not be able to understand. It's really good that they are online and publicly accessible, but there has to be more. Finally, there is still an enormous need for just basic benefits counseling, right? We need people on the front line who can immediately say, as soon as someone becomes eligible for benefits, you can still work, you can still save money. I spend a lot of time, Houston has the largest medical center in the United States, and I spend a lot of time talking to doctors and physicians, either developmental pediatricians or people who are treating folks with spinal cord injury, saying, you're on the front line of establishing someone's expectations for what their life with a disability can look like. And so here's what we're gonna talk about today. People can still work, people can still go to school, people can get married and have children. And I view benefits counselors in the same light. But it is critical, too, just to have more resources to support benefits counseling education for local providers. The last thing I want to say is that my office does actually provide free tax preparation for people with disabilities. We collaborate with a VITA site, Baker Ripley, and thankfully our local sign language interpreting agencies actually donate the interpreting services pro bono because it's so important. And in January every year, we start getting all these calls. When are your sign language when are your sign language tax prep dates? So it's great to be here with the IRS and to have you know that those resources are actually being very effective. So thank you.
Thank you, Maria. let me turn to Anil and sort of two options. One, reflect on what others have said here, but I also want a very specific question. We have heard many times today about more people with disabilities are becoming employed, but we're a long way from what the numbers should really look like. Unemployment and dependency on fixed income and Social Security benefits does not provide a lot of opportunity to save and move ahead. So I'm curious from your standpoint, and you work both on public policy development, and NFB is a huge organization with members in every state in the country. Why is there less attention or such limited attention on financial literacy? And how do we raise and elevate that in our discussions about employment and this connection, because the two do work together?
I need some assistance. Is there a button here that I'm supposed to
we
press?
got it.
Thank you. All right, so that's one thing. Having accessible technology is a deterrent. Just putting that out there. I'll move to answer your question by reflecting on some of the comments. I don't know whether Oscar in his presentation was trying to define the difference between literacy and knowledge and capacity. But I do think that based on the subsequent comments of other speakers, that there is a degree of knowledge and understanding and literacy about how to actually be productively engaged as a person with a disability. I'll reflect a little bit. I grew up in poverty as well, but I did not have a disability. But I learned my financial behaviors through modeling from my mom. My mom had to raise all four of us. She was a maid, I'll just say a domestic worker raising four kids. So you can imagine that's not a lot of money to go a long way. So she wasn't able to teach us how to really engage in a financial fashion that's productive. You know, she lived from paycheck to paycheck, if that. She used a lot of credit spending to get things done. I'll always remember how she had to work overtime on Christmas because she was charging Christmas gifts for us. So we weren't able to learn how to manage money other than watching her. We didn't have an allowance to learn how to budget. I tell people she allowed us to live with her. That was our allowance. And so she moved in that space, and those are the behaviors that were ingrained in me at that developmental stage where I learned how to do it. So even though I, like Andy, went out and got a job, I still operated in that same fashion. Even though I had enough money I could have been putting some away and saving, I just spent it. And it wasn't really necessary. I wish I had the money that I wasted back then. But again, there are a lot of those strategies that you learn. So when I became a person with a disability, luckily by that time I had gained more financial literacy, right? Because I had started putting money in a 401k and I was investing, that kind of thing. By the way, the investing thing, as you guys know, the Schoolhouse Rock, all those learning things, conjunction, junction. I didn't know until I was an adult that there was an actual Schoolhouse Rock little video that talks about investing. It never came across as a young black kid. You know, that was never this. I know conjunction junction. I'm right there with lolly lolly lolly, get your adverbs. But I never got exposed to the Schoolhouse Rock about investing, which is really another conspiracy theory there I have. Anyway, I'll leave that alone. So I did acquire that knowledge later about investing and the rule of seven, all those types of things. Okay, but then the disability hit. And this is when I tell people, literacy, financial literacy is important, but for a person with a disability, you have to be multilingual. Because everything I learned about investing and saving and all that is counter to what I learned to do as a person with a disability. They tell you, well, you can't make a lot of money. So it disincentivizes you to make money because it threatens your benefits. You know, all these different things. Maria did a good job of showing a really good example of how an opportunity could have been lost based on, you know, misperceptions of how. So you do have to become literate in a new way about the financial tools that are specific to people with disabilities. I don't know how many people in this room or paying attention virtually understood all of the aspects of what was presented by the previous panel, but you got to admit there's a degree of knowledge and literacy that's necessary for you to really comprehend and implement what those individuals were putting in place. So we have to do that in a way that gives that person that literacy, right? And then even beyond that, you have to do it in a way that motivates them to move beyond the social supports. I love the way, again, Maria kind of nuanced, you know, her brother. It's not the goal to keep him sustained through Social Security. Social Security is that floor that allows him to move away from Social Security without experiencing all of the negative potential impacts that Oscar and Andy described. You cannot work toward becoming financially independent if you're continuing to struggle just to meet everyday needs. So I love that. But you have to become knowledgeable about the Social Security work incentives. You have to become knowledgeable about the ABLE Act, all those different things. So the other piece I think that's important during this transition is in the private sector, and the public sector does it well too, we have to start making those financial tools and those remedies and strategies more in line with the mainstream ways of doing things. I love the fact, and I don't know whether this is true all around, someone here who's more knowledgeable can correct me, but I know that in some state, the ABLE Act is actually administered by the same body that administers the 529. That draws parallels to me. So when you can make the analogy that the same system that uses to help plan for college investment, right, is the same plan that uses to support the ABLE Act model, there's some synergies there that make sense, right? And it doesn't require you to be so multilingual in understanding the financial progress of what's going on. I cannot state highly enough to the answer to the last panel's question of what advice you give to other people with disabilities. This is it, this panel. You learn it, right? But you find models of behavior that are productive by individuals who are experiencing it. Because regardless of how much you understand about the policies and procedures of Social Security, ABLE, et cetera, until you find someone who actually has implemented it, who's dealing with it in a real way, that's when you get the best strategies. And that's the benefit of the National Federation of the Blind. We are a community of practice of blind individuals that through our life experience, we know the pitfalls of the Social Security cliff. I've experienced it. I wish I would have got into this model behavior from other people before I did. But now that I've learned it in a real way that will never, ever be lost, then I can share with other people too. So that's the piece, modeling that behavior. So speaking to the employment piece, which is really important, it's hard to work on financial independence when you're not really generating an income. I was able to sustain myself when I was on Social Security once I went blind, but I wouldn't say that would have been the pathway to my financial independence had I stayed on Social Security. So going to work is important, and it is commonly known that 73 to 75, whatever percent you want to use of people that are disabled, that are unemployed or underemployed, it's true. I think we do ourselves a disservice, though, by not acknowledging that 75% of individuals with disabilities that are unemployed are ready to go to work today. That's just not true. And what that does, that sets up the thing that as we motivate employers to hire people with disabilities, they get someone who's not ready to work, they get that person employed, and they find out that they're not able to perform the job productively, it sets us all the way back. That's one of the things that sustains the unemployment rate. So what we have to do, not only incentivize and motivate and work with employers, we have to continue to focus on the person with the disability. And that's, again, what the National Federation of the Blind, as a consumer organization, 50,000 blind people across the country, we work on reality checking blind individuals to make sure that they get the skills necessary to be competitive in the work environment. And that's important because you guys that are non-disabled, that are able-bodied right now, you continue to tell us every day how amazing we are because we can get up and get dressed in the morning, and because I can use Microsoft Word, I should be somebody's CEO. You know, you tell us that, and then we believe it. So then we, as an organization of consumers, have to go back and reality check all that damage that you've done to that individual to make sure that they recognize that there's a price they have to pay to be work ready. And then the last piece of that employment puzzle is we struggle with this every day, making sure that the systems and supports that are in place for everybody else work for people with disabilities. Mm-hmm. It's one thing to say that you go out and get an education, get a college degree, and go to work. You don't know how difficult that is for a blind person. And I'm sure that Frank could speak to how difficult it is as a person, a deaf person. But I go to school, you go to school, you have textbooks. I may have textbooks in an accessible format that I may use. You go to college and you have all these other avenues of getting information to benefit through the educational environment. I have to struggle just to make sure that I can get the tools in order to prove that I can be equally competitive with you in that academic environment. Imagine how difficult it is then when you move into the employment space. You go to work at a bank and you use a computer that's already set up for everybody else. You use a phone that's already set up for everybody else. That phone potentially is not going to work for me. Probably 90% of the time it's not going to work for me because it needs to be made accessible. We're working to make sure that technology comes out of the box and is accessible. It's beneficial to everybody. Devices I can use are devices you can use. In many instances, it's going to help you be better at doing it too. So I think that when we're talking about the employment aspect of this whole financial dilemma that we face, we have to make sure that we look at it in a holistic picture, right? And not think that the solution is there's only one answer to that, one remedy to that problem. So I hope that I have answered your question and added a little bit to the.
Absolutely, Anil, and always helpful perspectives. And what we're going to do, I'm going to go back to Andy. We're going to come once across. It's got to be short and a soundbite. Is people around the country, as well as the people in this room, have been listening, taking in a lot, lots of information, a lot of perspective from this panel in terms of where things are and where they might be. If you wanted to give, in a soundbite, not a long statement, but a soundbite, as I asked the first panel of federal agency representatives, you've been listening now for almost 2 hours, is what's the next step? If someone wanted to do better about where they are with their financial decision making, what would be that, what's your takeaway from today? And what's your advice to that large audience across the country? And short and concise so you can be quoted. And I'm going to you, Andy, because you're always quotable.
Oh my gosh. Well, I'd like to say that everybody in this room and probably everybody listening has a level of privilege of knowing that there's knowledge out there and being able to access it via internet or what have you because they're on the webinar. And going back to what Maria was saying, we have to recognize that privilege and be able to utilize that to move it down to the people that actually need financial literacy services to move them forward. So what I would say is engage your community organizations on this information. If you do not have access to it, contact your local independent living center because not everyone would have a Maria Town in their state to be able to help them with their resources. So go to your community organizations and demand financial literacy services so they can have greater access to all the information here.
Wonderful. Oscar.
Yes. What I might say is focus on building financial capability. And what I mean by that is a way of going back to my first remarks is financial capability, my perspective, is the ability to put into action the knowledge I have. And that requires that I have the knowledge, the skills, and also the opportunity. And the opportunity equals access to services. Many of us have the knowledge, but don't have the opportunity. Both of them are needed. So I would say this to anyone who is actually in that struggle, whether you're a person with a disability, a provider, or an advocate, to actually try to foster that notion of capability that is not only improving knowledge, but also the opportunities for people to put that into practice. A great example to me is having a VITA site, for example, right? There's actually a difference between me knowing that the earned income tax credit exists and actually having access through a free, trusting relationship that can allow me to have access. And the last thing I'll say about that is around disability providers, is that I think there we have the responsibility to actually build stronger partnerships between the financial community, asset building community, and the disability providers. I think there's a missing link that we've been trying to resolve there. And part of that, I think at the federal level, we also need to look for ways to improve access to funding and billable services for disability providers to spend time doing this. Because we can talk about this until the end of time, but as a disability provider, I need to figure out a way how I'm going to pay for my staff to be able to do that. And there are ways that we have not explored as much, through which Medicaid, vocational rehabilitation, ticket to work money, and others can actually help fund disability providers to spend time doing this. And I think that's the task that we have at hand as well.
Thank you, Oscar. And next, Joseph.
So I think we need to be focusing on two very specific things. The first one being we need to start younger. The earlier we pick up on those educational materials, especially with younger deaf students, the better. And much respect to Wells Fargo because they are expanding their educational curriculum for younger children, and that definitely is going to edge its way out to the disability communities as well. And the second area being inclusion. And inclusion means partnering with the deaf community and the deaf community's organizations. It also means hiring more deaf people. You'd be surprised at how businesses and organizations, how many of them reach out to CSD and say, we'd love to work with the deaf community, but we actually don't have any deaf staff or any deaf employees. So I think it's very important to start hiring those people with disabilities for these various businesses, and making sure that they're represented as part of the staff, and making sure that they provide a window via their experiences as people with disabilities. So yeah, those two things, start young and embrace the community.
Thank you. Maria?
A mantra in the disability rights movement is that disabled lives are lives worth living, and we need to continue to invest in the knowledge building, skill building, and capability building of individuals so that they have an opportunity to invest in their worth.
Thank you. And Anil?
See what you did? So you gave him exactly one, and now I got to get this narrative too, like the other guys did. But first of all, I apologize to Joseph for calling him Frank. I got the name confused, so I apologize for that. I think that we have to continue to create the synergies like the ones that I described so that things fall into place a little bit more and they make more sense to everyone. And we build a common language so that the financial literacy that's needed for people with disabilities is not uniquely different than just anyone else's knowledge of financial literacy. And we have to build that business case, right, to make sure that entities, and I agree, Wells Fargo is a good partner with ours too, because they recognize the business case of investing in our Braille program so that blind kids can learn how to read Braille so they can become competitive employees. So they invest in that. So we made the business case there. And then the last piece, we got to make it sexy. We got to make it to the place where it's appealing, right, and it draws people. We got to remove the phobias and taboos about this and make people who need those supports and need those systems not only understand them, but recognize that they need to use them and they want to use them. So make it sexy. So I would say synergize so that we're all speaking one language so that we can make a real business case, and let's make it sexy.
Thank you. All right, let's hear it for this wonderful second panel. I'm going to ask this panel to stay in place for just for a moment, a few minutes, and closing comments from Rita McLaughlin, Chief Education Officer, MSRB.
So good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the MSRB, I first want to thank you and to acknowledge all of your contributions. I think let's give another hand of applause to all of our panelists who have joined us today. I want to just thank them and acknowledge them. I also want to thank and acknowledge all of you here today in your commitment to ensure that there is financial literacy in all communities and inclusion and information available to all individuals. As we celebrate Financial Literacy Month, it is important that we all keep in mind about providing access and information as it relates to the financial markets and to help individuals make informed decisions and be independent in all of their activities. I think also today I'd like to provide a special thank you for all of those who have been a part of putting this event together today. I would especially like to acknowledge Michael and Kathy and Kristen and all of those who have made sure that today's event was well attended, was informative, and that was useful. And so let's provide them all with a hand of applause. So for those of you here at the MSRB and for those who are joining online, we appreciate your time and your presence here today. And with that, I want again to thank you all for your time and your attention today and for attending. The MSRB appreciates the ability to partner with NDI and the LEAD Center, and we look forward to future partnerships with the organizations and for your continued support and commitment to the issues. Thank you all.